Hi, my name's Naomi, author of A Locket of Love, and I'm here today to read you the first chapter. Off to see Nana O. As Molly let her head rest against the back of the car seat, her mum in front of her was humming along to a song on the radio. Molly turned her head and watched the world pass by in a blur as they drove along, weaving around the country roads. All the autumn colours flickered red, orange and brown as the leaves floated from the branches to the ground, heralding the approaching winter months. "Mum?" Molly asked. "Yes, love." "Are we nearly there yet?" Molly grumbled. Her mum looked in the rearview mirror at Molly, sitting limp on the back seat. "Not far now, love." Molly let out a deep sigh. She knew her mum's not fars meant that it could be 5 minutes, 50 minutes or even 5 hours away. Molly continued to look out of the window at the hills covered in trees. "I wish Nana O didn't live so far away," Molly muttered to herself. Suddenly the car screeched to a halt as Molly's mum slammed on the brakes. Molly was catapulted forwards, but her seatbelt caught her as she flung back into the seat. Molly's mum was already saying harsh words as a pheasant casually meandered out into the road, deciding whether to go forward or turn and head back the way it came. Molly's mum continued shouting at the pheasant, which was still standing in the middle of the road, as she reached the crescendo of her verbal abuse of the bird. The car horn drowned out the remaining words she spoke, and the pheasant flew off. Molly became a statue in her seat, holding her breath. She didn't want to draw any attention to herself in case she ended up being on the receiving end of her mum's temper. Molly watched the pheasant fly off. Lucky thing, she thought. The car jerked into motion as Molly's mum sped off. As they drove further on, gears grinding into place, it was no longer a pleasant journey. The car swerved sharply left and right around the corners as Molly's mum's anger continued to grow. Molly took hold of the car door handrail in an attempt to avoid being swung around in the back of the car. There was one more sharp swerve to the left, and then the car came to an abrupt halt. Molly let out a sigh and took a deep breath in, filling her body back up with oxygen, which made her feel lightheaded. She reached down and pressed the button on her seatbelt. It pinged back and was poised, ready to carry out its next duty of protecting another passenger, like a bodyguard. Molly could hear her mum grunting to herself. "I'll be glad when I don't have to do this journey anymore, flipping pheasant." Thinking he owns the road, Molly's mum turned around in her seat to face Molly. "Now remember, your Nana O is getting old, so don't cause her any trouble," she said through gritted teeth. Molly just nodded and reached for the car door handle, opening the door and jumping out. As she closed the door, Molly looked at the little cottage set in the hills with roses climbing up the side of the cottage walls. The house looked tired and in need of some fixing up, but there was something about this cottage that Molly loved. It always felt magical. Mysterious, like the walls were going to start speaking at any moment, sharing stories of all the things they had seen and heard. Molly smiled and made her way round to the back of the car, where her mum had already started to lift out the bags of shopping. She took hold of one of the bags and made her way up the garden path. Her mum followed behind her with the rest of the shopping. Molly turned the handle of the front door, and instead of the door creeping open, it glided, just as if someone was helping to open it from the other side. Molly looked behind the door, but no one was there. Molly paused on the doorstep. Molly's mum just pushed past her and was already in the kitchen and starting to unpack the shopping when Molly stepped into the cottage. Molly suddenly jumped back, dropping her bag. "Ah!" she screamed, clutching the chest. She heard a chuckle as she began to compose herself. "What's wrong with you?" "You look like you've just seen a ghost," Nana O chuckled to her in her husky voice from the kitchen doorway. "Nana O, you made me jump," Molly said as she picked up the shopping bag. "So I see," Nana O said as she made her way into the kitchen where Molly's mum was still unpacking the shopping. Molly followed her in and placed the bag she was carrying on the kitchen worktop. Nana O filled the kettle with water and brought the teapot to the front of the worktop. Placing fresh tea leaves in the strainer, Molly was already in the biscuit cupboard, getting out the biscuit barrel and placing it on the table. Having tea at Nanaro was like having tea with the Queen. Nanaro got out the best china cups and saucers, along with a bowl of sugar cubes and a jug of milk. She placed a plate in front of Molly. "Be a darling and put a few biscuits on there for us," Nanaro said, gesturing to the plate. Molly could never understand why the biscuits needed to go on the plate first when they were all going to end up in the same place, her stomach. But Molly did as she was asked and piled the biscuits onto the plate. She watched Nanaro shuffle around the kitchen, hunched over. Molly didn't know anyone else as old as her Nana, with her wrinkles carved into her face and her frail body. Her eyes, however, always had a cheeky sparkle to them, like they had seen a lot and been through a lot, and knew the mysteries and secrets of the world and of life. Molly was brought back from her thoughts as her mum pulled out another chair, which made a screeching noise on the tiled floor. Molly's mum sat down at the table and Molly brought the plate across and placed it on the table next to her. Nanaro brought across the teapot. She held the tea strainer over each cup to catch any tea leaves that might escape, and placed a cup in front of each of them. After putting in the milk, Molly's mum then placed one sugar lump in her tea. Molly copied. Molly stared at her mum as she knew her mum was just counting the minutes until they could go, until she had spent a reasonable, acceptable time with her mum and she could make her excuses and leave. Molly looked at Nanaro, who was happy to have the company, but knew her daughter's agenda. However, she still enjoyed the moment for what it was, even though her daughter's intentions were not benign. Nanaro broke into the silence. "So, Molly, how are your friends Dylan and Layla?" "Annoying, as usual," Molly said in a huff as she thought of her best friends who lived on the street. Wherever Molly was, Dylan and Layla were never far behind. "Dylan keeps beating me at sports," Molly said with disgust. Nanaro smiled as she sipped her tea. Molly's mum sat silent. Molly reached for another biscuit as more of her tea was being absorbed by biscuits than drank by her. Molly smiled to herself as she was one of the best things about coming round to Nanaro's house, the endless supply of biscuits. And her stories. "I wonder if we will have time for one of her stories today," Molly thought. Nanaro reached for the teapot to refill the cups. She reached across to begin filling her daughter's cup. Molly's mum placed her hand over the top of the cup, covering it. "Not for me, thanks. Otherwise I'll be needing the toilet on the drive home." Nanaro brought back the teapot and filled up her own cup. She didn't respond to the comment and just smiled instead. "If you will excuse me," Molly's mum said, getting up from the kitchen table, "I'll just make a start on your washing and ironing." She made her way out of the kitchen, leaving Molly and Nanaro alone. Molly swirled the remaining tea with bits of biscuits floating around in her cup. "Do you think we will have time for a story, Nanaro?" she asked shyly. Nanaro took another sip of her tea and placed her cup back on her saucer with a chink. "Of course, darling, but first we need to light the fire, and I need to wash the pots. Be a darling and go outside to the shed and bring a basket of wood back with you," Nanaro said peacefully. She made her way over to the kitchen sink and began to wash the empty cups. "Oh, Nanaro, I hate that creepy shed. I swear it's going to fall down on me one of these days. Not to mention all the slugs and spiders, and there is probably a giant deadly snake in there waiting to get me," Molly pleaded. Nanaro continued to wash the pots in silence. Molly knew what that meant. Nanaro wasn't asking, she was telling. Just then they heard her mum stomp down the stairs. As she reached the bottom, she stubbed her toe on one of Nanaro's many statues that was scattered around the cottage. "You!" And Molly's mum looked up to see the two of them looking at her. "Never mind," Molly's mum said through gritted teeth as she disappeared into the utility room. Molly took the opportunity to leave the room as the shed began to look more appealing in comparison to the wrath of her mum's anger. Molly made her way out of the front door, picking up the basket, which was already waiting by the front door to be filled, and headed round the back of the house to the shed, which was now slightly leaning to the left. Molly took a deep breath and opened the door. A shiver ran down her back. Molly leant in, making sure her feet stayed outside as she peered around for anything that might land on her or jump out. "Hello?" she said. "If you could all just stay where you are whilst I fill the basket up, and then I'll leave you to whatever you were doing," Molly whispered. She knew the creatures didn't understand English, but it made her feel better. Molly placed the basket just inside the door and started to fill it up as quickly as she could by grabbing as much wood as possible in her small hands. Then she scooped up the basket and ran as fast as she could back to the cottage. Flinging the front door open, it made a large bang as it hit the wall. Molly threw the basket into the living room, rubbing and flicking her body as if there were millions of ants crawling over her. She finished with a big shake. "Ugh, yuck, creepy, grimy shed," she muttered to herself. Nanaro picked up the basket and took the wood across to the fireplace. "Be a darling and fetch yesterday's paper from the kitchen and bring it over," Nanaro said, while she began to place the piece of wood into the open fire. Molly went into the kitchen as silent as a mouse, trying not to be seen by her mum. She grabbed the newspaper and headed back into the living room at a sprint to where it was safe. Her mum was never as cross when Nanaro was around. Molly passed the newspaper across to Nanaro, who scrunched up the pages and placed them into the fire. With a strike of the match, the fire was ablaze and burning bright. Molly was always amazed by Nanazo's ability to get a roaring fire going so quickly. Nanaro saw Molly's expression of amazement. "When you have been doing this for as long as I have, then you too will be able to get a blazing fire from a single match," Nanaro said wisely. She leant over and reached for the arm of her favourite chair, positioned next to the fire, and let out a sigh as she lowered herself into it. She shuffled around as she got comfortable, settling in for the rest of the day. On the small table next to the chair was 2 sets of glasses, a glass of water, today's newspaper, a toffee sweet, an alarm clock, and the pills the doctor had given her to take. Molly fetched a small 3-legged wooden stool with an acorn carved in the seat. She brought it across and put it in front of where Nanaro sat, ready to hear the story. Just as Nanaro was about to begin, Molly's mum came in with her arms full of freshly ironed sheets. She looked at what was happening in the living room. "Don't get too comfy, as we'll be going in a few minutes," Molly's mum said. She stared at Molly, clearly not wanting to stay any longer than she had to. "Of course not, darling. Molly was just telling me what her and Layla and Dylan had been up to," Nanaro responded casually. Molly felt her mum's gaze burn deep inside of her. She quickly broke eye contact and stared at the fire. They watched Molly's mum exit the room and listened as she stomped back up the stairs. Molly just continued to stare at the fire, wishing she could become invisible. Nanaro saw Molly sitting there on the stool like a frozen statue, but not like any statue that she had around her cottage. Her statues always looked happy. Molly looked frightened, but most of all sad. Just then Nanaro knew exactly what story she would tell today. "Right, let's begin," Nanaro announced, bringing Molly out of her gaze. Molly turned back to face Nanaro. "This story is..." As Nanaro began, she was rudely interrupted by the alarm on the table next to her going off. "Beep, beep, beep." "Bloomin' thing," Nanaro said, firmly pressing a button on the alarm. "That alarm's going to be the death of me," she grumbled. Then she heard Molly's mum's voice pierce down through the air from upstairs. "Don't forget to take your tablets." Nanaro picked up the box from the table by the side of the chair and unclipped the compartment that said "Today" on the lid. She emptied the different coloured tablets into her hand. She then placed the box back on the table, and in one smooth movement she tossed the tablets into the fire, and they were quickly swallowed up by the flames. "All done, darling," Nanaro called up to Molly's mum. Molly sat there shocked, with her mouth wide open. She couldn't believe what she had just witnessed. Her Nanaro being so rebellious. She had never seen this side of her Nana before. Nanaro readjusted herself in the chair, with the corners of her mouth curling up as she tried her hardest to hide the smile of satisfaction from her act of defiance. Molly looked at Nanaro, then at the fire, then back at Nanaro. Molly shook her head in disbelief. I have been doing just fine for the last 90 years. With a good lifestyle, a happy mind and heart. I don't need those things flowing around my veins. I'll go when I'm ready, and no sooner, Nana O proclaimed. Then Nana O became still. Before I begin our story, is there anything you want to tell me, Molly? Nana O asked lovingly. Molly shuffled uncomfortably on her stool, avoiding eye contact with Nana O. No, everything is fine, Molly said with a shooting pain going through her heart. She hated lying to her Nana so much, but the pain of telling her the truth was greater than the pain of lying. Or so she thought. Very well then, Nana O said, gaze held on Molly. She knew full well that deep inside of Molly was a chamber full of secrets, of fears that she was too afraid to let out into the light. Nana O looked at the fire. She had been around long enough to know that things would take their own course, that they would come out in time when Molly was ready. Maybe we could spur things on, Nana O thought as eyes began to glisten with hope. Nana O placed her hands on the centre of her lap. The room was filled with a feeling of warmth. The different colours from the objects around the room began to radiate more brightly. Molly got goosebumps as she looked around. Her gaze finally reached Nana O, whose breathing had slowed, making her look more peaceful and relaxed. Her wrinkles were less defined and her skin glowed as she sat in her chair. Nana O watched Molly taking in the surroundings and noticed that she had a puzzled look on her face from what she saw. Nana O smiled to herself. We'll save that story for another day, she thought. Are we ready to begin? Nana O said, bringing Molly back from her thoughts and into the present moment. Yes, absolutely. Molly said eagerly, waiting to hear where the story was going to take her. Nana O cleared her throat as if she was about to tell the story to every single person in the world. So if you want to find out what happens with Molly, the story, and Nana O, then pop over to Amazon where you can get your copy today. Have a great day.